Thank you, everyone. I like to start off by saying when we talk about Huntington disease research, especially here in Canada, the one thing that's really encouraging to me is we really punch above our weight in terms of dollars and research funding, in terms of the efforts of the Canadian researchers, the Canadian clinicians, and everything. Canada is really poised to be, one of the central countries in terms of Huntington disease research, and I think that's something that's really encouraging. So today, I thought I'd put together a little presentation to talk about some of the people in the Canadian Huntington disease research space, some of the work they've done, the advancements that we've made thanks to them, and also then get into a little bit about just a little touch on like clinical trials and what's going on in the different spaces and different approaches to those. And then also the Huntington Society of Canada, our funding strategy, the different kind of programs that we've been funding and how we're helping to move the needle a little bit. So I'm really looking forward to this. I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about myself because it's fun. So yeah, as I mentioned, or as I was introduced, my name is Alexander Maxan. I'm originally from the East Coast, so I grew up in New Brunswick. I then went to university in Nova Scotia. I did my master's and PhD in Quebec City, all in the Huntington Disease Research Labs. And then I went down to the United States, the University of Michigan, where I did my postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Neurosurgery. So for a long time, I've been working in these Huntington disease research labs. This image on the right here is probably my favorite picture that I ever took during my academic career. This is a live mouse model of Huntington disease. What you see is this mouse that I was actually able to surgically remove a part of his skull, put a little glass window on top, and then using a really cool microscope called a 2-photon microscope, I was able to like neurosurgically and stereotactically inject a virus that I designed that expressed Huntington protein. And I was able to look at how this extracellular protein was taken up by cells, released by cells, how it moved around blood vessels. Before, like 20, 30 years before I even got into research, though, we really started to see some major advancements. So back in the 1970s, this woman who you see here, her name's Dr. Nancy Wexler. Dr. Wexler is probably one of the most famous people in terms of Huntington disease research. She came from a Huntington disease family. She became a molecular biologist and researcher during her time in school. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, when she was researching Huntington disease, she identified this area in northern Venezuela. There's a small town called Maracaibo on Lake Maracaibo. And this is way down in South America. And 50 years ago now, they found that the prevalence of Huntington disease in this small community was about 40 or 50 times higher than anywhere else in the world. So they thought this is the perfect place for us to go and study Huntington disease. So she put together this incredible team of international researchers. They started traveling back and forth between South America and North America. They were meeting families affected by this. They were building family trees. They were collecting blood samples so they could do genotype and tests. And then out of this, on March 26, 1993, they produced this very, very important paper called A Novel Gene Containing a Trinucleotide Repeat that is expanded and unstable in Huntington disease chromosomes. So this is the first time the gene responsible for Huntington disease was ever specifically identified. I have a personal connection to it because this came out on my birthday. So if you ever want to think about how long it's been since we've discovered the Huntington gene, it's exactly how old I am. There's also a very cool Canadian connection in that two of the primary researchers, Marcy McDonald, who's difficult to read here, and James Gusella, are both Canadians and actually from right here in Ontario. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the contributions that these Canadian researchers have done. So they're both currently professors at Harvard University. They live down in the States, but they did both grow up here in Ontario. And then they did their PhDs in the molecular biology boom of University of Toronto. And this was when this kind of area of science was very new, very much emerging, and they became pioneers. They're both responsible for the discovery of the Huntington gene, along with a team of dozens of others as well. But because of that, we've been able to develop genetic testing for Huntington disease. We've been able to build animal models. We've been able to build cell models of Huntington disease, and then really identify these different modifiers to disease onset and change translational research as a whole. So they are two of my idols, especially when it comes to Huntington disease research and science in general. I'd love to give them all the praise in the world. We also have Dr. Michael Hayden, who is very famous in the space. Dr. Hayden, who works at the University of British Columbia, I'm pretty sure he's the most published Huntington disease researcher of all time, with over 1,000 publications credited to his name. He pioneered genetic discoveries in Huntington disease and as well as predictive testing. He's an expert in this area in advancing translational research and therapeutic development. He's started his own pharmaceutical companies. He's developed drugs that are currently being tested to treat Huntington disease and so on. In 2010, he was nominated or appointed a member of the Order of Canada, which is a very big accomplishment. There's only a few thousand people who have ever received it for their contributions to science and the humanities here in Canada. And he's also the founding director of the Center for Molecular Medicine and Therapeutics, which is one of the biggest clinics for this field across the country. Another researcher who I have a lot of respect for and was very fortunate to have a connection with is Dr. André Parent. He's a professor at the Université Laval, though, in Quebec City. And while I was doing my PhD there, he was actually one of my professors. He was appointed an officer of the Order of Canada in 2017, which is even another rank higher above member of the Order of Canada, so even fewer people, and it's all thanks to his contributions. He's most popular for mapping the basal ganglia, so the parts of the brain that are responsible for Huntington disease. He kind of created a map to learn about the different connections and how these are dysregulated in a lot of these diseases, specifically Huntington disease, but also others. So as I mentioned, he illuminated neurocircuit changes and movement disorders, and then really helped to advance our understanding of the brain structure and function relationships. One of my fun stories with Dr. Parent is he taught me a course called The History of Neuroscience. And this was one of my favorite courses during my PhD. It was about 8 or 10 individuals in this course. And it was a 3-hour lecture once a week, and we all go. And he's by this point in his career, he wasn't really conducting a whole lot of research, but he was still teaching at the university. And we show up to this class one day, and in the class, he arranged all the desks so that it formed a U around the room. And he laid out his book collection. He had a private, rare book collection. And some of these books, I'm talking like first edition books, valued tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars each, including these ones here, which were the first editions by a gentleman named Santiago Roman y Cajal, who did the first ever description of the neuronal pathways. So the neuronal theory, so showcasing the brain is comprised of all these cells that connect and interact with each other in the different structures. So this is a very important book when it comes to neuroscience. And I think this is interesting because Dr. Parent was laid out all these books, and he told us as students, hey, you guys can go pick them up, sit down, read them, take 3 hours, just look through all these very, very rare and impressive books that I was very fortunate enough to get to hold and read, and take pictures, and then come back and write an essay, and that'll be your assignment for the end of the year. And I thought this was really interesting because it kind of reminded me of protein synthesis in cells and cell biology and how it's related to Huntington disease. Because when it comes to cell biology, you have your nucleus, which is the part of the cell that's very important. It houses the DNA, which is the most important thing. But DNA is, very, very important. The cell wants to keep protected. So when it wants to make a protein, instead of having the DNA go outside of the nucleus, it keeps it in this protected area. Then it creates a copy called mRNA, which has been very, very important to Huntington disease research recently. The mRNA then goes outside of the nucleus into the cell body or the cytoplasm, where it is being able to be read and be modified and helps create proteins. I thought this was kind of interesting because it's kind of like that class. We had all these very, very important books that were very valuable. Couldn't bring them home with me, couldn't help bring it home and use it to help write my essays, but we were allowed to take pictures, we were able to make copies, and then be able to use that to create what we wanted, the end product. So for Huntington disease, kind of similar, and I thought that was interesting. This is another one of the pictures from my research when I was a student, and I like to use it because it's a good representative of what students do in research labs. So here's a cell culture dish. So if you think of a little plastic plate that grows a cell model of Huntington disease, you grow them, spend a long time growing them, and then you're able to stain them for different things so that we can learn. So here in red, you can see actin. So it's kind of just a structure of the cell. So you can see what's maintaining the cell body. In blue is DAPI, which is a staining for the nucleus, so we can see where the DNA is. And then in green, you can see the mutant Huntington protein. I like showing this because it really puts research costs into perspective for people. An experiment like this, just to get these two pictures, probably costs a couple $1,000s. The little blue vial to create DAPI is about that big, and it's a couple $100s. And then we use antibodies. So the same way humans produce antibodies in our blood to fight infections, scientists have been able to retool antibodies to detect the things we want. So here I used an antibody to detect actin. and then another one to detect mutant Huntingtin. And then we use a secondary antibody, so an antibody that detects the first antibodies, and it also has a fluorochrome on it, so something that glows a really cool color. And then we go to the microscope and spend probably an hour to take a picture that looks like this and shows exactly where the proteins, so we can look at mutant Huntingtin protein, we can see what it's interacting with, where it is located within the cell. And I think that's really important, but it's interesting to learn about science and the cost of these experiments and what goes into them. Something like this probably takes about 3 days to run this experiment. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the leaders in Huntington disease research and people who've really inspired me over the years. These are 4 individuals who are located here in Ontario and have had major impacts across the field. So we have Dr. Ray Truant from McMaster University, Dr. Cheryl Arrowsmith from the University of Toronto, and Dr. Stephen Ferguson from the University of Ottawa, and Dr. Chris Pearson, who works at Sick Kids nearby. Dr. Ray Truant is a prominent biochemist and professor at McMaster University. The Truant lab has investigated the Huntingtin protein's normal role and how polyglutamine expansions can disrupt them, leading to neurodegeneration. He began dissecting the complex structure of Huntingtin early in his career, identifying it as a scaffolding protein involved in cellular processes like protein transport and interactions. Recently, the Truant lab's work is linking HD to impaired DNA repair. His team showed that normal Huntingtin acts as a scaffold in DNA damage response complexes. In HD, mutant Huntingtin disrupts this complex, leading to mitochondrial dysfunction, ATP depletion, and increased DNA damage in patient-derived cells in mouse models. This research has identified defective enzyme activity as a culprit, suggesting that inhibitors that are commonly used in cancer therapies could be repurposable drugs for HD to mitigate neurodegeneration. We also have Dr. Cheryl Arrowsmith at the University of Toronto. She's one of the pioneers of the Structural Genomics Consortium. So we're looking at the structure of the Huntingtin protein, as you can see here on the right. Her team has some of the strongest, some of the best, most expensive microscopes in the world, and they look at very high magnification of the protein itself and what else it's interacting with. So if you look in cells, if you look in animal models, if you look in humans, we're learning more about the function of the Huntingtin protein every day, and it's a lot thanks to the research they do. For example, one thing they might do is imagine a piece of paper and you stick like one or a couple of pieces of the Huntingtin protein on it, and then you wash it over with a bunch of different molecules that you think might be interacting with it, and we can learn more about the function from it. Then you rinse it off and you find out what's sticking to it so you can see the interactions and what this protein is working with. And those are the kind of experiments that run at the Structural Genomics Consortium. So we're learning more about the function of the protein and the interactions. We also have Stephen Ferguson here, who's at the University of Ottawa, who's done a lot of work on glutamate receptors in Huntington disease. So he's very interested in learning about the neurotransmitters and how those signaling are being processed within Huntington disease and how the loss of the cells affects that, because glutamate is very known to be dysregulated in Huntington disease as well. And then lastly, Christopher Pearson. So Christopher Pearson is one of the early pioneers in a process called somatic instability that I'm going to talk about a couple of times in this presentation. He works at a Sick Kids hospital, and so he's worked a lot on repeat instability. So you might have heard of a CAG repeat number or a CAG repeat number in Huntington disease. You know, maybe somebody does a genetic test and they find that they have a 45 CAG repeat. Well, Chris was one of the first people who said, actually, this number could get longer over time. And then he's also developing therapies right now that could reduce the number. So he's trying to contract the number and hopefully be able to treat Huntington's disease that way. So he's doing some very foundational research. And so then I thought I'd talk a little bit about the clinical research and opportunities and what's going on in this space. This is one of my favorite slides. When I first started going to Huntington disease conferences, some of the people would tell me, you know, we started doing these research conferences 25 years ago. And when we first started, we had maybe 1 or 2 pharmaceutical companies who would show up and be interested in developing drugs to work in the space. Now there's over 60. So there's a wide range of these different pharmaceutical companies who are developing these new strategies. Most of them aren't in clinical trials yet. It's a lot of preclinical work, so they're still testing their models in cells and in animal models, but it's really inspiring to see that so many pharmaceutical companies and so many players are involved in the game right now. This is a slide created by one of my colleagues named Sarah Hernandez, and I absolutely love this slide because it shows an overview of all of these different companies and their different approaches. So at the top, you can see here the symptomatic approaches. We've been developing drugs that help to treat one specific symptom of Huntington disease for about 30 years now. Actually, I think probably closer to 50 years now. Some of you might have heard of tetrabenazine. We also have similar drugs, deutetrabenazine and valbenazine, that have been in development. These are very similar drugs. They're meant to help treat chorea, or the movement disorder aspect of Huntington disease, and so on. We've had other companies like Sage Therapeutics that would try to develop a drug that only treated the cognitive aspect. But we also have a lot of drugs that are disease modifying. So this is kind of the new hot area of research, and we see a lot more efforts going into this. And I just wanted to show this, and it's going to be talked a lot more during the HD Buzz keynote tomorrow, so I didn't want to step on their toes too much. But I just wanted to show there's a lot of different approaches that these companies are taking to try to treat Huntington disease, whether it's through somatic expansion, through Huntington lowering, cell replacement. So you might have heard of cell transplantations or stem cells, those kind of studies, axonal transports, different receptor activation, and so on. And then we talk about how we deliver the drugs, whether it's through ASOs, whether it's through a gene therapy, and so on. So I just really wanted to emphasize that there's a lot of different companies working in the space, and we're looking at it from a lot of different angles, which is really encouraging and something we didn't have 10, 20 years ago. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the prevalence of HD clinical trials. So yes, there's a lot of companies working in the space. How successful are they? Are they able to get their drugs to trials where we're actually able to test them in humans? And over time, we're seeing a very, very large expansion of this. So back in 1995, we only had one symptomatic therapy that was being tested in humans. Now, if you fast forward today, it's not just the color orange. It's not just this one theme, but we actually have a lot of different colors because we have a lot of different approaches. There's even more every year, year after year. One thing I'd like to note was 2015 is when we saw the emergence of this blue color. That is the Huntington lowering strategy. So it took us about 20 years from the discovery of the gene to the first time we were able to get a drug into humans that we thought might have an effect at targeting specifically to the gene. We've seen clinical trials emerge and expand quite rapidly since then, especially in the Huntington lowering space. We're still seeing others in pretty much every other aspect and everything we're trying to target. And then I also like to emphasize here that there's nothing that's been brought to clinical trial yet, but somatic instability has been a hot topic at a lot of these HD research conferences. And in the next year or two, I'm expecting quite a few companies to have molecules that are targeting this process, and they'll be entering clinical trials as well. So that's something encouraging. So you can expect that these bars to keep going up. So there's even more opportunities for people who are interested to participate in clinical trials across a wide different range of approaches. What's going on in Canada right now? Well, honestly, not too much, but also not nothing. There's two different types of studies. We have observational studies and we have interventional studies. The difference is an observational study is not testing a drug. They're interested in learning more about Huntington disease, so they'll recruit individuals with Huntington disease and they'll say, we'd like to monitor you. We'll do cognitive tests, we'll do blood tests and so on, but we're not going to give you a drug to try to treat it, but they just want to learn more about the disease. Then we have interventional studies that are actually testing drugs and testing the effects of the drugs. So right now in Canada, we have 3 active ongoing interventional studies. We have Roche's Generation HD2. It was originally PTC Therapeutics, now purchased by another company called Novartis, the rights to their drug, and then Neurocrine. They still have an open label study. The study's actually finished now, but the people who are part of the trial still have access to the drug. And then Neurocrine Bioscience, again, they developed a drug called valbenazine. In 2024, it was approved in the United States. It hasn't been approved in Canada, but Canadians who are part of the clinical trial still have access through an open label. And then we have several observational studies. The most popular one would probably be Enroll-HD. By show of hands, who here has heard of Enroll-HD? Most people. Okay, that's pretty encouraging. So I'll talk a little bit more about Enroll-HD here too. So what are these trials looking for? Well, there's a couple of things that they're actually looking at. They're looking at which drug delivery method is the best. Because a lot of them, they deliver the drugs to individuals a few different ways. Some of them have oral therapies, so simply a pill that you can swallow. It might be every day, possibly for the rest of your life or for as long as the study. Some of them have intrathecal injections. So it's tough to deliver drugs to the brain in general. So one of the ways that we want to do it is find out which is the most efficient way to deliver these drugs into the deep parts of the brain that are affected by Huntington disease. And then there's a fluid in our spinal cords that actually goes up and goes through the brain and all around it. It's called the cerebrospinal fluid, and it bypasses the blood-brain barrier. So when you take oral medications, it has to cross the blood-brain barrier. But if you inject it into the spinal cord, or also neurosurgically, just injecting it directly into the brain with a long needle is something we see more common in gene therapies as of late. So these are things that are considered amongst these clinical trials, which drug delivery method is the best for our drug in delivering it to individuals with Huntington disease. I mentioned a lot of them were Huntington lowering drugs, which has been a hot topic since about 2015. There's still the question of how much can we safely lower Huntington. When it first emerged, there was a lot of debate about whether we should be targeting just the mutated form or if we can target total Huntington as well, and then how much of a percentage reduction should be safe, because the Huntington protein is essential for development. We've done experiments in mice where we've cut out the Huntington gene completely, and we found out the mice didn't even survive birth. So we know that this is an essential protein for development, has a lot of different roles within the cells. How much can we lower it safely? Again, can we safely lower both the mutant and the non-mutant Huntington? Also, which biomarkers can we observe to predict disease progression? Over the past probably 10 years, neurofilament light chain protein has become a very hot topic in terms of fluid biomarker or liquid biomarker. It's also measuring things like the Huntington protein itself within the blood or the cerebrospinal fluid, or it could be MRI imaging of the brain structure. So what tests should we be doing to monitor and view that we're actually having a change in disease progression? And then lastly, will reducing DNA repair ultimately lead to slower disease progress, is a question that the somatic instability drugs are going to be targeting here soon. So next I want to talk a little bit about HD funding programs in Canada. How much money is being invested in this nationally, what the Huntington Society of Canada is doing through our clinical fellowships, Navigator Award, undergraduate student fellowships, and so on. So one thing I looked at was federal government allocations towards Huntington disease specifically, and compared it to Huntington Society of Canada. I looked at 3 different time frames of, well, this one's 5 years, that one's 5 years, this one's 4 years, so it makes sense that this one's a little lower. The big blue bars you see here are CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So this is the federal government's allocations through open competition. So it's significantly higher than the Huntington Society of Canada. We can't really compete with the federal government in terms of funding science. They also have NSERC and FRQS, which is specific to Quebec. Those two do a lot of fellowships, so it's a lot of small studentships, maybe $20,000 a year for a master's scholarship or a PhD or so on. What I like to take away from this, though, is over the past 15 years, Huntington Society of Canada has steadily increased our research contributions and research funding. We've also increased the number of fellowships we've been able to offer over the past 9 years, which has been really encouraging. I know it looks like it's a small chunk, especially comparing that to that, but I'm really proud of what the Huntington Society of Canada is doing. I think, being able to offer almost $5 million in funding over the past 4 years has been really, really encouraging. I think it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger. What else is interesting is that these big blue bars tell me that CIHR is funding about $3 to $4 million every year in terms of Huntington disease research. As a whole, across all life sciences, so every disease, cancer, everything else you've ever heard of, CIHR funds a little over $1 billion a year. So it ranges 1.1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.1, and so on over the past 5 or 6 years. So that means funding directly related to Huntington disease is about 1/400th or 0.25%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but considering how many different diseases there are and the implications of it, I think it's a pretty high number and something I'm pretty proud of. I wanted to talk about some other leaders in the Huntington disease research space. So we have a clinical neurology council who advise me on anything related to neurology, clinical trials, and the care related. It's comprised of Dr. Thiago Mestre at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Sylvain Chouinard at the CHUM, so the Centre Hospitalier Université de Montréal, Dr. Oksana Sikorsky at the University of Alberta, Dr. Mark Gutman, who's a consulting neurologist formerly here in Toronto, but he's since retired, but he still offers us his expertise quite often, and Dr. Blair Levitt at the University of British Columbia. And thanks to them, they've helped the Huntington Society of Canada offer fellowships to individuals who have completed med school, completed their residency, and are interested in learning more about their training for Huntington disease. So we have, in 2024 and 2025, we were able to offer 2 neurology fellowships to Dr. Phelan Fernandez and Dr. William Leduc. Dr. Phelan Fernandez was originally from here in Toronto, went and did her medical school over in Ireland, did her residency at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and is now completing her fellowship at the University of Calgary under the supervision of Dr. Justina Sarna. Dr. William Leduc is our 2025 recipient. He's also at the University of Calgary training with Dr. Sarna. So these are two individuals recently out of med school starting to get their expertise in Huntington disease, treating, participating in clinical trials, and so on. And it's really meant to be the next generation of caretakers. I'm also very happy that we have Dr. Carolyn Dance, who's here in the room with us, who is our neuropsychiatry fellow. So the University of British Columbia, Dr. Andrew Howard reached out to me a couple of years ago, and they said, we have this incredible person who's interested in doing their fellowship in neuropsychiatry, has an interest in Huntington disease, but our fellowship program is a 2-year program. We only have funding for 1 year. Is the Huntington Society of Canada willing to provide the funding support for the 2nd year of the fellowship? And we were like, of course, absolutely. This is an incredible candidate, somebody we absolutely want working in Huntington disease, and neuropsychiatry is an area that's kind of been underrepresented by our organization because we typically only funded neurology fellows. But I'm really happy that we were able to expand that and welcome somebody else to the space. I'm looking forward to see how that goes over the next couple of years. And so the Navigator Award is the Huntington Society of Canada's flagship research funding award. We provide funding to projects of direct and immediate relevance to Huntington disease, whether it's improving the understanding of pathogenic mechanisms or has significance to respect to the development of new treatments and so on. So these are the awards that researchers at universities might apply to, or any academic institution. It's $75,000 a year for 1 to 2 years, so typically a 2-year, $150,000 fellowship. We've been doing this award for 23 years now as an organization, so for a long time, even way before my time at the organization. Typically, it was about 1 to 2 awards a year, so we've done 37 awards historically. We've provided funding to 17 different institutions and 24 different researchers over this time, and a total amount of over $5.1 million, which is something that I'm pretty proud of for a small organization like ours, or relatively small. We also have like an interest graph here. I just wanted to show this to show you how much interest there is in Huntington disease research. So from 2017 to about 2023, you could see we received about 7 to 8 applications. That means there was like 7 to 8 research teams, universities across the country who were interested in running a Huntington disease research project. Over the past couple of years, the interest in this program has spiked. So there's a lot more researchers who are applying every year looking for our funding because they have new ideas that are related to Huntington disease. They really want to help drive the space forward, and I think that's really encouraging. Last year, we were able to partner with River Phillip Foundation and Brain Canada, who've collectively have contributed over $1.2 million over the next 3 years to funding these programs. So who helped decide where that money goes to? Well, it's not me. My job is around the administration around this, but I rely on experts with much more experience in Huntington disease, and we have a Huntington Disease Research Council, the HSC Research Council here. So Dr. Tiago Mestre from the University of Ottawa, Dr. Tam Mayori from the Huntington Disease Society of America, who's also a research assistant in Ray Truant's lab, Dr. Rachel Harding from the University of Toronto, and Dr. Mahmoud Pouladi offer their advice and expertise into which programs and projects we should be funding. In 2024, we were able to fund the project of Dr. Sean Sanders, Melanie Alpo, and Dale Martin. This is a collaborative project between the University of Guelph and the University of Waterloo, entitled DLK as a Novel Therapeutic Target to Treat Huntington Disease. So they identified a molecule that has been recently studied in other neurodegenerative disorders and is related to the cell death signaling pathway. They thought it would be very interesting to study it in Huntington disease as well. I believe they're going to be speaking this weekend. I'm very much looking forward to their talk. And then on the right, I'm happy to announce our 2025 recipients. This information isn't public yet, but I'm sharing it now, and hopefully by the time these are uploaded, it will be public information. But we're very pleased to announce 4 different funding projects to Dr. Blair Levitt at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Lynn Raymond at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Alex Parker at the Centre Hospitalier Université de Montréal, and then a collaborative project between Dr. Francesca Cicchetti and Dr. Aurélie de Richaquet at Université Laval in Quebec City. So what have we been funding over the years with these projects? Well, I broke this down. I looked at the different themes in Huntington disease clinical trials and where our projects have been funding. So if you look at this graph, the themes are on the left. So it could be cell transplantation, it could be Huntington lowering, it could be something related to metabolism or the mitochondria, neuroinflammation or immunomodulation, symptomatic treatments. And then the bars, the colored bars that you see going across, is a timeline of when clinical trials in that theme emerged over time. So you can see, for example, in 2015 is when we first started having the clinical trials related to Huntington lowering. Then all the dots are the projects the Huntington Society of Canada has funded over time and where they fit within those themes. So I just like showing this because I think it's really good to show a couple of things. One being that we're funding projects across all different angles of Huntington disease research. And two, I like this one, somatic expansion inhibition. So this is an area that I'm expecting we're going to start seeing some new pharmaceutical companies emerge and have clinical trials over the next year or two. And Huntington Society of Canada has been funding research on this since 2016. So we're a little bit ahead of a curve. And I'm pretty proud of that we've been able to identify these as important areas of research that are going to help change the future of Huntington disease therapies. What else have we been doing? Well, in 2023, we started our undergraduate student summer fellowship. So since then, we funded 19 different undergraduate students. The idea was, a lot of these students, they work in research labs throughout the school year, and then during the summer months, they have to go work summer jobs to be able to pay for university. I was one of those students. I worked a landscaping job mowing lawns just so I could stay in the city of my university, and then on evenings and weekends go into the research lab and continue my Huntington disease research. So when I joined the organization, I was able to get us funding support of $5,000 each, so enough to cover maybe rent for these students so that they can stay and work in research labs over the summer. The idea is we're going to try to get people interested in Huntington disease as early in their careers as possible. Science students are great because there's a few different avenues they could take, whether they become researchers themselves, clinicians, some of them are going to med school. And that's kind of the point I'm making here. So like 2 of our fellowships recipients from this past summer are actually already in med school right now. So hopefully within 3 years or 4 years, they'll be graduating. And then maybe if they're interested, based on their experience working in a Huntington disease research lab, they might be more inclined to stay in that kind of field. Maybe they'll become neurologists. Maybe 10 years from now, they could be neurologists to people who are attending conference this weekend and so on. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the future of this program. It'll be a little while before we're able to see tangible results, but yeah. And then lastly, the things I wanted to talk about were for individuals who are interested in getting involved in HD research and learning more, there's a few different resources I wanted to talk about. Number one is Enroll HD. So this is really contributing to human clinical data. For those of you who are unaware, it's a global observational study open to people who have HD or who are at risk. So it involves going to your local clinic, visiting your neurologist, doing an annual visit, takes a couple hours, answering health questions, doing a quick neurological exam, providing a blood sample for genotyping and biobanking. But if you're at risk and you don't want to know your gene status, that's okay too. You can check a box and say, I'm not interested in knowing. They will de-identify everybody who's a part of this trial. So they won't have any names. They won't tell your doctors your gene status or anything. And then they also collect family history, but they do keep that information, they keep it de-identified so that researchers can use it. So what have we been able to take from this? Well, over the past 12 years that Enroll HD has been going on, they've collected over 1 million data points that have been made available to researchers. So any professor from around the world who's interested in learning about data from individuals with Huntington disease can apply to this. They submit an application, say, I'm interested in looking at this, and then the company behind Enroll HD will send them back here's a collection of all the data, and something like 200 publications have come out of it over the past 10 years. And that's thanks to the 22,000 participants, so individuals who are either at risk or have Huntington disease who have participated across 156 different sites. So almost every major city in Canada has a site for Enroll HD, and we have 23 nations who are participating, so 23 different countries. So it's really incredible. And from this, we've been able to do disease progression modeling. We've been able to identify new biomarkers that could be relevant to future Huntington disease research, predicting clinical trial outcomes. You might have heard recently of one of the clinical trial updates that instead of, they didn't have a placebo arm. Well, originally they did, but then they stopped doing it because the way the drug is administered and the length of a clinical trial, it's difficult to ask individuals to want to participate, and you might end up getting a placebo and not actually getting the drug, and it's borderline unethical. I don't know if unethical is the right word, to expect people to stay 5 years as part of this trial when they're not actually receiving the drug. So the company reached out to regulatory agencies like the FDA, and they got approval to use matched data from Enroll HD. So instead of having to do a placebo arm, we could say, hey, we have a 24-year-old woman with a CAG repeat of 42. And then now we can pull data from an Enroll HD, find a 24-year-old woman with the CAG repeat of 42, see how they typically progress with Huntington disease. So it's kind of the same as having a placebo. You're not getting treatment. We learn the progression, and then we can now compare that to clinical trial data. So it's going to help accelerate a lot of research on that front. We also have volunteer patient engagement. So I myself, along with my colleague at the Huntington Disease Society of America, have a patient volunteer group called HD COPE. So for individuals, we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow in our other presentation, but for individuals who think my voice could have an impact in these clinical trials and my opinions could matter, that's something that we're interested in providing to the pharmaceutical companies and so on who are working in the space, and also researchers, making sure the community voice and input is heard. Could be anything from, is parking at clinical trial sites good enough, to how often is too often to come in and get a lumbar puncture, so like an injection in the spinal cord. So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out to me. I'd love to have more representatives. There's also HD Trial Finder. So this is a program developed originally by the Huntington Disease Society of America. It is on the Huntington Society of Canada website. They gave us permission to embed it. You can log onto this, answer a few questions related to who you are, your connection to HD, and so on, and where you live, and it'll give you a list of all the clinical trials and research opportunities that are nearby that you would be eligible to participate in. It has more than 7,000 users, and you can actually try matching or rematching today. And then lastly, Power HD. So if you're interested in, again, providing your thoughts and helping to advance research, this company called RareX partnered with the Huntington disease communities, Huntington Society of Canada and Huntington Disease Society of America, to create Power HD, where you can go on and just a long questionnaire. And they're asking for community members to self-report their answers. And then you can check boxes and say, I want to make my questionnaire answers available to researchers studying X, Y, and Z, and then it'll be sent along to them, and they can use the answers to your questions to learn more about the Huntington's disease community and be able to apply that to research in the future. So here are the linked websites if you're interested in learning more about those. So if you want to learn more about HD research, my #1 recommendation is checking out HD Buzz. They're going to be giving our keynote speech later or tomorrow. They're absolutely fantastic. They take all research advancements, all clinical trial updates, and put it in language that anyone can understand. They're very fantastic at it. There's the website for Enroll HD. I strongly encourage you to check out the resources available at the huntingtonsociety.ca, so the Huntington Society of Canada's webpage. And then also there's the link to Trial Finder, which is embedded in the Huntington Society website. That's everything for me. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.